Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, HR Compliance Simplified, Protect Your Business from Unseen Risks. My name is Mike Bankhead, and I am the Vice President of Strategic Alliances for AccuSource HR. I'll be your moderator today. So I would like to take this opportunity to introduce today's presenters. First, we have Dan Doss. He is the Director of Sales and Sales Engineering at HR Logics. Dan Doss, as a National Sales Director, has 20 plus years of experience in human resources compliance, helping human resource professionals tackle compliance challenges. He specializes in background screening, I-9 and E-Verify, and various other compliance areas. Dan leverages his expertise to guide clients towards successful outcomes. And next we have Cynthia Woods, who is the Vice President of Marketing at AccuSource HR. Cynthia has over 20 years of experience in the human resource services and employment background screening industries. Prior to her current role at AccuSource HR, she held leadership positions directing sales, business development, enterprise account management, partner relations, and marketing. At AccuSource HR, she is responsible for overseeing marketing, media, communications, and strategic projects. She also frequently serves as a guest speaker and a corporate trainer. Cynthia holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Management and a Master of Business Administration degree. She also is a longtime member of the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM. She is also a member of the Professional Background Screeners Association, where she serves on the Industry Practices and Government Relations Committee. And our last but not least is Sabrina Champagne, President of State Tax Credits at Oncentive. Sabrina has spent the last 2 decades engaged in various aspects of economic development. Some of her accomplishments include providing federal and state tax credit advice to a number of leading Fortune 500 companies, which yielded millions of dollars in annual savings. She has facilitated numerous negotiation package deals to offset costs associated with corporate expansion and training activities. She has also worked in the Ministry of Canada to implement the targeted wage subsidy program for a large U.S. retail corporation. She uses a consultative approach when forming partnerships with clients to capture both negotiated and statutory credits to reduce their effective tax rates. So now I will turn the presentation over to Melissa Prentice.
Sounds good, Mike. So this is Dan. I'm actually filling in for Melissa. So let me jump right into it, and I'll talk about Form I-9 compliance and get to the basics, and then talk about the recent updates that we've had. So if you want to go ahead and I know we have a poll question to start off with. So getting into the key compliance requirements, so we'll jump into that. Just kind of going into a quick overview, and I'll jump right into talking about the keys. I think most people are pretty familiar with the I-9 form as it pertains to the regulations. As I mentioned previously, most people must complete Section 1 on or before the first day of hire. We do get a lot of questions around this as it pertains to staffing, but the really important thing to understand is that employees complete the I-9 form. They can complete it way before the start date. In fact, they can do it up to 1 year prior to the start date. So we see employees being onboarded. A lot of times they can be onboarded 3 to 6 months in advance. I see this a lot with universities. It's a good example where, for example, they'll hire adjunct professors a couple months in advance. The one thing to note, though, you can do it as early as possible or up to 1 year, but you still must verify within the first 3 days of employment. And that's the big thing, and really that's what the auditors are looking at. Number 2, an agent or representative has to examine the original documents and complete Section 2 within 3 business days after the date of hire. There's a caveat now with the new recent remote verifications, but more to come on that as we go. The employee has to attest to his or her employment authorization. Again, present acceptable documents as evidence of their identity and their employment authorization. So that's another key one. I do see a lot of pitfalls here I've seen government permits actually provided as verification documents. So we've seen just about everything. Ensuring the employee has selected or identified that they're a citizen of the United States. On the paper form, a lot of times that checkbox is missed, so you want to make sure that they're identifying that. And with that, you want to make sure that their documents are specific to the employment citizenship status that they're making and correlating, and that they're not mismatching the citizenship status to their documents. There really is no exception for the remote hires. That comes up a lot. Really, the only big difference is now the remote hires, you can do the virtual reviews. And the main thing on that is you want to confirm that you're using E-Verify. Going to the next slide. And then I see that we have a poll question. So it looks like we have a pretty high percentage of people who received fines or haven't received fines to theirs, and that's really what's important with that. If you're unsure, I think that's something to go back and kind of look over. So jumping into the errors for the actual I-9s, I think that's something that's really important when we get into it. They're always increasing. I've seen them increase over the 20 years I've been doing this, especially since I've done audits beforehand. We never experienced that, but the big thing is it increased again to $272 for the minimum payment. Now, that's something as simple as just forgetting to put a date in. Simple things where there are simple errors where an employee, it might be entering, their birth year with the current year. That can be a penalty. That's a minimum penalty on a form. Max penalties are more administrative type errors. They can go up as high as $2,700, and that's really more when you're looking at blatant negligence. So obviously, when you start looking at doing the math on this, you onboard a higher 100 individuals, and you start doing the multiplications, by 100 or 1,000, you quickly get up into high dollar amounts. When you see recurring issues, so when you get recruiting, re-verifying, the rehiring violations, this is where it really starts to add up. And it kind of looks, this is where the auditors are looking for a rat hole to go down. So they can go up as much as three times. It starts around, at 676, and it can go all the way up to 5,400, and then obviously all the way up to almost 30,000 for a third offense. It's really just critical important that you have your processes in place as it relates to the overall management of your I-9 forms. Along with the processes that you're using in the organization, I also think it's important to think about how the representatives, the hiring managers are trained around the I-9. So on that, a couple of key things is how to avoid these. So you want to make sure everything is well documented. You want to make sure the staff has been trained on the procedures and the platform. You want to make sure you're doing periodic checks. When I say that, monthly, quarterly, the other thing with that is purge the I-9 forms that can be purged within the recommended timeframes. And then finally, just kind of sum it up, internal audits to make sure that everything is in line and operating as it should be. Going into the next slide. This is a really good example. It happened back in January of 2022 with a staffing firm. I do want to point out the firm did challenge some of it. So the fines were reduced. The final number wasn't 1.5 million, but regardless, nobody wants to be caught in a situation where you have a fine of any dollar amount or, the brand damage that comes with it. The big one on this was the employer was allowed employees to continue working, even though they knew that they were not authorized to work in the United States. So again, a blatant error. I'm sure no one will do that on this call, but that does happen. The other thing was there was a failure to prepare or present 513 forms. So how did that happen is when the auditors come in, a lot of times they'll look for payroll records. They look for over the past 3 years, and then they compared that about the I-9s. And then that's where they literally found 513 records were completely missing. And again, that's where it's really important to audit against your payroll records, compare against that, your head count or your I-9 count. When we look at preparing 276 forms in a timely fashion, what that really means is they are late. So they are past the 3-day period to complete the form. I think the main thing is this is something that's obvious that could have been avoided. The main thing that I've seen in my experience is the auditors aren't really sticklers on day one because there's flexibility around that. They're definitely sticklers on day 2, and especially if that form is not completed within that, those 3 business days. With that, I do get the question that comes up a lot, does that include Saturdays and Sundays? It does not, so the answer is no. They are looking at weekdays. But again, the ultimate thing is try to get the forms done as soon as possible, within the first 1 to 2 days of an employee being onboarded. More on the right of this, I think these are just things that are really key things to think about as they're going through, not skipping over the fields. That's a big no-no. Making sure the employees writing in NA or a system can handle, making sure all the fields are entered in. A really good example of this is other names used, obviously, you'll see a lot of that where it's left blank. So you want to make sure that's a populated field, even if it's just within NA. Signing and dating, very important. A lot of times just things that are, looked over and missed. One thing is we do see missing pages around the I-9 form. Now, going back to the simplicity, we are moving back to a one-page I-9 form, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. I think the main thing is make sure that you're paying very close attention to the overall formatting around the I-9 form. For example, a US passport has the letter C, with 8 to 9 digits behind it. So going into the next slide. The big question I get is, what's going on during the evaluation period? And so from my experiences, some of the key things is, you want to sit them down and ask and see what they're looking for. They are looking at the size of business. They're not concerned whether you're small or mid-size. They're really looking at, where they can go in and assess fines, and kind of find a hole where they can dig into. So they do consider the size of the business, but it's not, the big factor. The good faith effort, I think, is the most important step. What does that mean, though? It's that you have policies and procedures in place. Now, with the policies and procedures, are you actually, defined? Are they defined, and are you actually following those policies and procedures? And they're just not written in a manual somewhere. Are you trying to follow the rules and regulations? As you know, there's been a lot of changes. We have a new I-9 form that's out. Today's the day to do all the COVID re-verifications. So again, making sure you're keeping up to date with everything and keeping consistent processes across the board while everything's changing too. I think the main thing here is that there's an understanding that they know you may not be perfect, but the more is that there's a good faith effort to comply with all the rules. And really that's what they're considering. So, when you get into a serious violation, is there blatant disregard? You had somebody who was authorized to work and, they just knew they were out there working and didn't bother to do anything about that. That's a lot different than just having a couple forms where they missed a date or skipped over something. And then I think the last one is prior or previous violations. It's pretty self-explanatory. If they come and they give you a warning, or a small fine, and then you keep doing it again, and there's case studies on this, that's where they really come after you and you start seeing the large fines come up. So jumping into a little bit more about, what's happened. Today is the last day. So going back to that slide, last day to update and go back and verify all the forms that you utilize with the COVID flexibility. I do want to pause right there because we just met with Jackson Lewis yesterday. The USIS is definitely understanding on this matter. The number one thing is that you are currently in the process. So no reason to hang up, panic, hang up and go and start verifying everything. It's really the main thing is they're looking that you have the process and you're working on it now. I think finally, there are a lot of, they are okay with going back to the web meetings too for virtual reviews. And that's probably the biggest change that's happened. You don't have to go back to the full in-person verifications. The number of key things that I do want to point out on that is you do have to be using E-Verify, number one. So that's one of the key things. With that, you do have to maintain all of the documents. Now, when I say that, the one thing I do like to point out is that it's compliant to hold on to the documents, but also make sure that you're holding on to them and you're sending them in a secure fashion or receiving them in a secure fashion. So if you are doing a video verification, they're not turning around and sending over personal sensitive documents over a Gmail, for example. And then the last thing, going into the last slide, the DHS, as I mentioned before, they've released a new I-9 form. And it really, the key point here is it goes along with the new remote process. I think also important is that now it's back to one page, so it makes it a lot easier. There is a remote checkbox for the new alternative process. So just keep that in mind. You do with the current form, you can use that up until October 31st. and then you must use a new form that's out. So I know what, I'm going to pass it back over to the rest of the team.
So I believe now we're going to go ahead and go into our background screening compliance, and I'm Cynthia Woods. And first, I'd like to go ahead and read our legal disclosure. So the content that we are providing today is for general informational purposes only, and it should not be construed as legal advice or serve as a specific guidance. AccuSource HR strongly encourages seeking the advice of qualified independent counsel prior to engaging in any legal decisions for your own individual organization. And with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about FCRA. So FCRA is the main federal legislation that governs the background screening industry. And there are 4 main sections that apply to employment background screening industry. The FCRA itself is this massive document that has all types of legislation in it regarding the use of consumer information for tenant screening and credit granting purposes and everything. But as far as employment background screening purposes, we just have 4 main sections to concentrate on. And those 4 main sections are Section 604, which is our permissible purpose for conducting a background screen. Section 606, which is relates to investigative consumer reports. 613, which relates to the use of public record information for employment purposes, and finally, Section 615, which refers to adverse action. So adverse action is, if you do a background screen on someone and based upon something that you identify in that background screen, you decide not to hire that individual, you are then required to take adverse action, and we're going to cover the requirements for that process. So Danielle, if you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about permissible purpose. So to conduct a background screen on someone, you have to have a legal permissible purpose to do so. And there are some very specific requirements if you're going to conduct a background screen for employment purposes. So for employment purposes, you need to have the written permission of the consumer to procure the report. And that report, when you're procuring that report, you must provide that get that written permission. You must provide it in a clear and conspicuous disclosure that you're going to obtain this report specifically for the purpose of employment. Your disclosure and consent forms need to be standalone documents. In other words, you can't include other extraneous information in it. There's been a lot of lawsuits in the past in the employment background screening industry that have related to employers combining the disclosure and consent with, say, an employment application, or including additional information with those disclosure and consent documents related to, limitations of liability and that type of thing. And so you would really need to ensure that that those documents are standalone documents and that there is not any extraneous information that is added in with those documents. So in conducting consumer reports, you may decide to do a specific type of consumer report called an investigative consumer report. And an investigative consumer report is a little bit different than a standard background screen in that in a standard background screen, normally you're obtaining public information. You're obtaining information on whether or not someone has been arrested for a crime or has a criminal offense on their driving record, that type of information. That is all public record. In an investigative consumer report, you're focusing in on information about that person's character, general reputation, personal characteristics, or mode of living. Some examples of some types of investigative consumer reports might be like an employment verification or an employment reference or even a personal reference. And in those type of situations, a person is actually giving you their opinion and their feedback on that individual from their own perspective. And so because that is opinion-based and not factually based, it does require a specific type of disclosure. So in an investigative consumer report, you need to ensure that the user clearly and accurately discloses to the consumer that it's going to obtain an investigative consumer report. That disclosure needs to include a statement of the consumer's rights to request that information, and must also provide information about the report and the summary of the consumer's rights. The disclosure has to be in writing, and it needs to be mailed or otherwise delivered to the consumer within 3 business days after the date in which the report was first requested. Now, if you are doing a standard disclosure and consent and you include information about an investigative consumer report, you can absolutely do that, and that absolutely can stand as the disclosure to the consumer. And then finally, the user procuring the report has to certify that the reporting agency who basically has done the background screening report will comply with the disclosure requirements and will comply in the event that the consumer has questions about that report or wants to dispute information contained within it. So Section 613 is a little bit different in the fact that it actually applies to the consumer reporting agency and not to the employer. But under Section 613, furnishers of reports for employment purposes must do one of 2 things. They either must, at the time that they obtain the information, obtain the public record information, they either need to notify the consumer that this information has been obtained and provide them with a copy of that report, or they have to maintain strict procedures that are designated to validate that information at the source of record. And generally, when you're talking about like a criminal report, the source of record is the court of record. It's the court where that case was tried. And so really the consumer reporting agencies can follow either procedure, and I've seen both put into practice in the background screening industry. But the purpose of this section is to ensure that the information that is reported on a consumer is true and accurate at the time that it's reported, and that if information is reported on a consumer, that consumer has a right to dispute that information and correct any inaccuracies. So now we are at adverse action. And as I mentioned earlier, adverse action is when you conduct a background screen on someone and there's something that comes up in that background screen that leads you to make the decision not to hire that individual. And there's actually 2 steps to the adverse action process. There's a pre-adverse and an adverse action step. During the pre-adverse action step, the employer needs to provide oral, written, or electronic notice to the consumer that they are, going to take adverse action. And basically, that's usually a letter to the consumer that indicates that we conducted a consumer report on you, and based upon that consumer report, here is the information that is contained within it, and based upon this information, we may or may not hire you, essentially. In that letter, you also need to include the name, address, and telephone number of the consumer reporting agency that furnished the report to the employer. And if that consumer reporting agency is a nationwide agency, and most of them are today, then you also need to ensure that they include a toll-free number as well. So additionally, in that letter, you need to include a statement that the consumer reporting agency did not make the decision to take adverse action, that this action is based on the decision of the employer, and is unable to provide the consumer with specific reasons as to why adverse action is being taken. Additionally, you need to provide to the consumer the electronic, either oral, written, or electronic notice that they have a right to a copy of their report and to their rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And finally, you also need to include a statement that the consumer has the right to dispute the findings that are contained within their report. So all of those requirements are contained within that pre-adverse action notice. Once you've sent that letter off to the consumer, then you need to wait a period of time before sending the adverse action notice. And part of the reason for that is to give the consumer time to dispute the findings if they believe that anything that is contained in that report is not accurate. There really isn't a statutory period of time that you need to wait, but most of the legal experts and a few of the courts and decisions have placed that time period at right around about 5 days. And there are some states and municipalities who actually have gone further and actually designated a specific number of days for a waiting period. I think probably the highest that I've seen is about 12 to 15 days. But for the most part, generally about 5 days is the rule of thumb. Although we do encourage everyone to check within their own legislation in the areas that they do business and make sure that there isn't any municipal or state regulations that require them to follow a different statutory time period. So in addition to all the things that employers need to follow as far as the Fair Credit Reporting Act is concerned, we also have state and local compliance considerations that also need to be taken into consideration. And some of these are ban the box regulations. A ban the box regulation is basically employers are required to remove any language or any designation on their employment applications that requires an applicant to self-disclose criminal history. And I think we've all seen this throughout the years of you'll see an employment application and it'll say, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Ban the box legislation basically indicates that you have to ban that box. In other words, you have to remove that designation from your employment applications. And part of the reasoning behind this is to allow a person to get through the interviewing process and for them to kind of present themselves on their own merits without the stigma of any type of criminal history before an actual background screen is conducted and that type of information might come to light. Another type of legislation that has become very popular lately is fair chance legislation. Fair chance legislation basically gives offenders a chance to reacclimate themselves to the community, obtain meaningful employment, and really be able to rehabilitate their lives. And so the fair chance legislation that is popping up in different states today generally has certain restrictions on how an employer can treat criminal information that they receive on a background screen. So it might limit the type of information that they can use for specific roles. It might require them to designate in writing how that criminal offense affects the actual role that the person is going to be serving in. There's all different types of legislation out there, but the sole purpose of it is to allow people who have criminal records to, basically go on with their life and reinsert themselves in the community and become productive. There also is a lot of legislation that's been coming out recently that it relates to equal pay statutes. Equal pay statutes basically restrict the employer from asking the job applicant about their previous compensation history during the interviewing process and even through the background screening process. So it used to be as a CRA, we were able to verify what someone's previous compensation was with a previous employer. And now in a lot of situations, we're restricted from doing that because equal pay statutes basically prohibit that employer having to ask, or that candidate having to reveal what their previous compensation history is. And the sole purpose behind that is to basically start identifying positions and their compensation based upon the merit and the job duties that are associated with the position itself, and not to disparage certain groups based upon what they might have made historically in the past and being limited by that. So I guess we are now at a poll question. Which of the following regulations impact your organization's background screening compliance? We'll give you guys just a moment to answer this question. Okay, so it looks like a lot of people have banned the box regulations in their jurisdictions. And it looks like, that's pretty much tied with marijuana laws. And yes, marijuana legislation is one of the fastest moving forms of new legislation that is impacting, employers today, as many more states legalize marijuana use and begin to put restrictions on employers in testing for marijuana pre-employment and during the course of employment. But it looks like a lot of people are not quite sure about what type of legislation is impacting their employment background screening. And so we can kind of address that a little bit in a moment when we talk about best practices. So the last piece of legislation that I want to talk about, or regulation that employers need to be aware of when doing employment background screening, is the legislation by the EEOC. So the EEOC, they are very tied to Title VII of the 1991 Civil Rights Act. And so as part of ensuring that there is not desperate impact on certain minority groups or other protected classes, they have come up with a three-pronged test that employers must use when they are evaluating the results of a background screen and have identified a criminal record or other piece of adverse information. And that piece of adverse information, the employer has determined would prohibit them from hiring that individual. So this three-pronged test is basically that the employer must consider the nature of the crime. And then they must also consider the time that has elapsed since that person committed that crime. And then finally, the nature of the job. So for example, if you have someone who, say, is going to be a cashier and they're in a busy restaurant and there's people, all around them, then if they had a past criminal offense, say for a drug offense, an employer would probably have a hard time drawing a line between, and let's say that criminal offense occurred, say, 7 years ago. That employer would probably have a hard time drawing a line between a person being in a highly supervised role, not a high level of control or impact into business operations, and the fact that that crime occurred, a significant time ago. Those pieces together might make it difficult to make that determination that you couldn't hire that person simply because of that offense. Conversely, say you have someone who is a child care professional and they have, contact with children, often in an unsupervised nature. And that person conversely had a crime that was, say, 3 years ago, and that crime was related to some sort of abuse or harm, to a child or a person. An employer in that situation probably would have a much better chance of clearly defining that this person would not be suitable for this role because of the type of crime that it was, the fact that it was a short time since it had elapsed, and the fact that the nature of this person's job is to care for others in an unsupervised fashion. And so with the EEOC three-pronged test, the one impact that it really has on employers is it used to be in our industry that employers would come up with these adjudication matrices where they would identify a list of crimes and basically say, if a person has been convicted of this crime, then they are not eligible for employment. And that basically they refer to that as bright line adjudication. In other words, it's very clear, bright lines. If you have this crime, if you've committed this offense, you are not qualified to be employed by our organization. And there was no real gray area in that. With the EEOC guidance, employers now must look at each offense, each individual as an individual, and they have to look at each criminal offense in its totality based upon time that, the nature of the crime, time that's elapsed, and the nature of the job, and make a determination whether that individual is suitable for the specific position that they would hold within the organization. So Danielle, can you go to the next slide? So finally, we're going to wrap up with some screening compliance best practice tips. So one of the top best practice tips that I can give you is make sure that you align with a background screening provider that is very dedicated to investing in technology, specifically technology that helps make compliance easier. So you want to partner with someone who offers electronic disclosure and consent and automatic capture of the acknowledgement of that disclosure and consent based on jurisdictional specific forms. So as I mentioned earlier, there's certain states and municipalities that have specific rules in regards to ban the box or other legislation that requires specific types of disclosures to applicants. And so a lot of the software that's out there today will actually allow you to ensure that you're capturing the correct consent, not just for Fair Credit Reporting Act compliance, but also for compliance with specific jurisdictional requirements based upon whichever address that applicant puts in as far as their residential address, and also based upon the address that the applicant puts in specific to their work location. And having that ability for a background screening company to assist you in that process of ensuring that you're obtaining the correct disclosure and consent is huge in ensuring that your organization remains compliant throughout the background screening process. You also want to make sure that you're utilizing pre-adverse and adverse notification within an automated technology as well. That automated technology will allow you to preset the time period between the adverse action notice, the pre-adverse action notice and the adverse action notice to ensure that those are sent out at the specific time periods that are required. And it will also help you ensure that the process is followed all the way through. And then finally, you want to ensure that you work with a organization that provides quality access to compliance resources and is constantly keeping you updated on changing legislation. As I mentioned before, this is a field that moves very quickly. I literally get alerts on either new legislation or court cases that there's been action on almost on a daily basis. And so it's very important to have a partner who's keeping you informed. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn this back over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Cynthia. This is Sabrina Champagne, and in consideration of the last 20 minutes, we'll go through these next few slides rather quickly. And we'll kick off this segment with a poll question here, just to help us better understand if anybody currently has a hiring incentives or tax credit practice in place. And I do want to call out that the other two topics we've discussed are definitely required programs. However, this is it's a non-required program. However, it is an opportunity to really help you identify some savings to offset the costs associated with remaining compliant with your HR solutions. Okay, so very nice to see that a quarter of you do have a program in place. Half of you don't, and some are unsure. And quite honestly, this is very common across small and medium businesses. As of now, most enterprise companies have chosen to implement programs because, as mentioned during the introduction, these programs can be rather lucrative and really reduce your tax rates that you're paying to the IRS, and then sometimes even at a state level. So the main topic I'm going to talk about is this work opportunity tax credit. This is a federal income tax credit. So this will go against your federal income tax, not your payroll tax or sales tax or anything like that. However, during your onboarding process or application process, it's really important to insert a WOTC screening in order to take advantage of these different programs. As you can see, the maximum credit value can range from anywhere from $1,200 to $9,600, and that's dependent upon the different categories that we'll get into. It is a permanent reduction, so this is something that can't be taken away from you. If you qualify for the credit, then the IRS will absolutely reduce the amount of federal income tax that you are required to pay to them. If you have a large amount of WOTC credit and last year you paid a significant amount to the IRS, you're able to amend your return, and that's called a carry back 1 year. But if you're in the opposite situation and you have a really large credit and you're still trying to ramp up your business and you're not paying that much in income tax right now, this credit will carry forward for 20 years. So for some business owners considering, well, we're not really profitable right now, or we're really not paying a lot, as you continue growing, these credits can be really lucrative so that when you are required to pay a lot, like I said, there's a 20-year carry forward to utilize these benefits. I do want to call out that this is a current prospective credit, so it does require the screening of a candidate within on or before the date of hire. The form that is completed by the applicant contains information. It's a federal form along with a Department of Labor form that identifies which category they may qualify for. And it's important to recognize right here that those forms must be submitted to a state workforce agency within 28 calendar days. So unlike the I-9 where the weekends don't count, for the WOTC program, the weekends do count. Those are calendar days. So it's really important to have a good understanding of how the program works, getting these forms not only completed by your new employees, but then also to get them submitted to the appropriate agency within that 4-week time period. So these are the different categories of WOTC credits. When you're looking at individuals and you think, well, who qualifies for this? We're seeing a lot of people really qualify for the unemployed and disabled veteran categories. There are multiple categories for hiring veterans specific to just those individuals that have served in the U.S. government. You'll see individuals who might have been receiving temporary assistance for needy families, formerly known as welfare. Some people are currently receiving SNAP benefits, which used to be referred to as food stamps. People living in just designated areas may qualify. The federal government has designated various boundaries throughout the country that if an employee lives within that boundary, then they qualify for a tax credit for you. And again, I do want to call out that these are tax credits available to you as the employer, not to the employee. By you hiring these employees, then you benefit with the income tax credit associated with that hire. Individuals receiving supplemental security income, they might be receiving that for a number of reasons. And then also individuals that had been felons or summer youth employees will qualify. I do want to highlight that, as we mentioned, Cynthia had mentioned the ban the box statutes, and obviously there's a category here dealing with ex-felons. It's really important to make sure that the information included in your WOTC screening is not part of that application process. In terms of pre-hire, because with this, if you do incorporate that, then you want to make sure that your recruiters aren't necessarily having visibility of that. A lot of companies choose to outsource this program because there are so many nuances and details. And again, with that ban the box, when you ask for tax credit purposes, that action falls outside of the laws related to ban the box. Asking these questions should have no bearing on your hiring decision, but it should have a bearing on whether you're trying to take advantage of this program. So you can continue to ask for that category within states with ban-the-box legislation, and it is absolutely legal and within the boundaries of the ban-the-box legislation. So what industries are best for this? We've listed a few on here, but quite honestly, every industry qualifies. Nonprofit companies, we didn't list them here because they can qualify, but it's a very limited segment of individuals that could qualify for the program, and the program would then be applied against their payroll tax liabilities, because nonprofit organizations don't pay income tax. However, we've seen this really benefit organizations in the healthcare industry, grocery stores, trucking companies, call centers. Manufacturing is a great industry for this. And we're seeing a really big rise in the assisted living industry. So pretty much anybody who has a lot of annual hires, they hire and maintain for at least 400 hours is ideal. This will change depending on how many hours are worked and wages paid. So it's an actual calculation based on those different metrics. So here's just a highlight example of the average benefit that these different industries can achieve based on implementing a really good tax credit program. You'll see professional services. We see, even though a low eligibility rate, because there's a longer retention rate, and usually we're seeing a lot of more veterans going into the professional services, and there's a higher rate for those veteran categories, which is why you see that average credit around 3,400. But even in the manufacturing, you're talking $2,100 and $500 per employee annually. So if you are hiring 100 people and 25% of them qualify, then that would be 25 times $2,150 on average that you would receive a tax credit for annually. But again, as long as you implement this process before you hire those individuals, so that you have those forms submitted within that 28-day window. It's really important, because if you don't submit the forms, then that credit is lost and there is no way to go backwards. This is only what they call a prospective credit, looking forward. Again, just highlighting that we've seen, here's a hypothetical case. You've got a restaurant with 50 hires annually. About a dozen or so of their new hires would qualify. Based on the industry standard, that could yield a $25,000 annual tax credit for that restaurant. And then in addition to this federal WOTC program, there are loads of both state and federal tax credits for creating jobs, for investing in the neighborhoods where you do business, research and development, as well as renewable energy tax credits. Again, I've highlighted the opportunity zones and empowerment zones. And then for our businesses with tipped employees, there's an additional payroll tax credit, which is known as the FICA tip tax credit, to benefit and receive the FICA taxes back from your payroll taxes. And we'll finish this up with our last poll question here. We're just wondering if you'd like any more information on anything that we've discussed today. And with that, I'll give it back.
Thank you, Sabrina. And while you guys are filling out that poll, you can also go ahead and click on the questions tab and submit your questions there. And we'll go ahead and get to answering a few questions before we wrap up. So the first question, I will shoot it to Dan. Can I complete some of the forms using the virtual option and other forms in person?
Yeah, I think the main thing, you can complete the forms. If you have some cases, there might be a case of like a disability, something where you have to revert back to the paper form. Main thing in answer to that question is make sure you're keeping a consistent process and able to access them at all times.
Great, thank you. This next question for Cynthia. Is it illegal to test for marijuana in states where it is legal for use?
It all depends on the state legislation. There are some states who have different prohibitions on actually testing for marijuana for employment purposes. However, there are several states that are silent on it, and there are specific positions that a person might hold within an organization where where an employer is required to test due to a federal regulation. For example, if a person is in a role that is a DOT safety sensitive position, then the employer might be required to test for marijuana, based on that person's role. So it really kind of is position specific and also specific to the actual regulations within that particular jurisdiction.
Great, thank you. Sabrina, is there a minimum number of new hires to qualify for WOTC?
Great question. There is no minimum. We've seen some clients with just one annual hire for whatever reason. And if you screen that new hire and they qualify for the WOTC credit, again, they could yield a credit up to a maximum of $9,600 if they're a veteran.
Dan, this next question is for you. Can the employee present different documents for in-person re-verification than what was presented for the virtual review?
Yes, they can, and it's a good thing to keep an eye out for, especially if you're looking at an electronic system that you can be able to track the sales and accept that document. For example, somebody provided an expired, passport, and now it's expired, so they brought in their driver's license, social security card. They absolutely can do that. Great question.
Thank you, Dan. Cynthia, can I combine the disclosure for an investigative consumer report with the consent for the report?
So yes, you can, provided that that you follow all of the guidelines required for an investigative consumer report. That that disclosure and consent can be combined with the standard disclosure and consent for standard background screens.
Thank you. Sabrina, if I wanted to start processing for the work opportunity tax credit, when would I receive that tax credit?
Great question. So even though this is a federal income tax credit, it's administered by the state workforce agency. So every state has a different process for not only submitting the applications, but then a different process for sending you back what's called a WOTC certification. I do want to highlight that you cannot claim this credit until the state certifies that that new hire is truly eligible for WOTC. So again, it's really important to make sure that you're following the guidelines and potentially working with a vendor to make sure that every rule is being followed and that you're receiving that certificate that again can vary from anywhere from a few weeks up to a few months.
Dan, do I have to change my I-9 processes if I was using notaries or other live in-person verifiers to complete Section 2 of my I-9 forms?
No, you don't need to change the process. It's a good question because you might have multiple processes. You might have, with hybrid workforces now, maybe some are coming in the office, so you have an HR representative doing it, where the remote sales reps and other people that are not coming in the office, you might be doing a virtual verification. So you absolutely might have multiple processes with it.
Cynthia, can I outsource the pass-fail determination to my background screening company if I give them guidelines to follow and still meet the EEOC requirements?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, you can not outsource it completely. You can give them guidelines as to what you would consider a pass. In other words, if there's certain criminal offenses that that you would be acceptable within your organization, you can designate to your consumer reporting agency that you're willing to, that not to highlight those offenses and to go ahead and not highlight that there needs to be additional review for them. However, if there is an offense that would potentially cause the person not to be qualified for employment, the most that the consumer reporting agency can do is go ahead and flag that individual offense as something that requires additional attention, and then you would have to go through the EEOC process to, and then evaluate on an individual basis whether or not that person is eligible for hire. That's a really good question.
All right, we'll have one more live question, and then we'll need to close out the webinar. So Vanessa, do we have one more question?
Yes, for Sabrina, last question. How do I know if my CPA is already calculating tax credits for my business?
That's a really interesting question. So most CPAs do not manage a WOTC program because, again, this is dealing with your recruitment and your HR workflow. And CPAs usually only look at your information either on an annual or quarterly basis. So more than likely your CPA is not managing this, but you should absolutely reach out and discuss it with them just to see.
All right, great. Well, great questions, and thank you all for submitting those questions. And if you did enter a question that was not answered, then we will have a member of our team follow up with you directly after the webinar and provide you with that answer. But just want to offer a thank you to Dan and Cynthia and Sabrina for facilitating the webinar today, and special thanks to all of you for joining us today. On behalf of AccuSource HR and the HR Logics team, thank you for being in attendance, and we wish you all an enjoyable day.